definitely.
Thank you.
Outfield, you chose Cleon Jones in left field, Carlos Beltran in center field, and Darryl Strawberry in right field.
Mm-hmm.
With everything going on with Carlos Beltran, I mean, you can't take his numbers away from him.
Yeah.
Was not my favorite player, but I mean,
Yeah.
his numbers, when you look at his numbers, they're amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the best offensive players in Mets history. All the other things that maybe you want to criticize him for, the 2006 NLCS strikeout, the whole injury situation he had in 2009 where he opted to get surgery on his own. A lot of fans also thought maybe he was not giving a full effort, but that was just kind of him. He just glided to balls, and he wasn't exactly he didn't give off the look that he was a hustler, but he was, he certainly gave a full effort, in my opinion. And also just what happened in the recent months with the sign stealing and then his quick removal as manager. I don't think those things should affect how he was statistically and how great he was as a Met. I mean, we talked about 41 home runs in 2006. That 2006 season, one of the best offensive seasons any Met has ever produced. And the Mets wouldn't have gotten to the NLCS without him. So I look at that strikeout, and even as a fan, shortly after that season happened, I never looked and said oh, I can't stand Carlos Beltran, or it didn't shape my feelings toward him. So I know some fans, they'll never get over it. For me, it was one of the most devastating losses of my life, but I don't personally go and want to just hate on Carlos Beltran because of that. So all the things that have happened to me, they certainly they will allow for people to have their own opinions. To me, it doesn't affect it. I even think he's still a Hall of Famer. I'm disappointed that he was involved in the sign stealing. However deep he may have been involved in it. Story in The Athletic said he was pretty much the ringleader of it. I don't mind saying I'm doubting that, but who knows if that was just people trying to throw him under the bus. So we'll see what comes from that. But it's pretty clear that he had involvement in it. Do I think that affects his Hall of Fame chances? I don't think it really does. Maybe it'll take him a few more years to get in, and it might put a little bit of tarnish on him, but we have no proof that it made him, that he did it earlier in his career yet. I have not heard of anything like that. So to me, I still think he gets into the Hall of Fame, and frankly, I still think he gets in as a Met.
All right. So you pick different players from different decades, really, in the outfield. Darryl Strawberry in right field. I mean, that's where I grew up in the '80s with the Mets. He was awesome. He came up with Dwight Gooden, some great teams. They didn't really reach their full potential with the Mets. Mm-hmm. What was in your mind when you selected Darryl Strawberry in right field?
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought that was a no-brainer. Most home runs in Mets history, despite I know what we may think, and that his career was a little bit of a disappointment because his expectations were so high after being drafted number 1 in 1980 by the Mets. Everyone thought he was just going to be, kind of like Ted Williams, where he would, be a surefire Hall of Famer. And although he made, I think, 7 All-Star games, 7 straight with the Mets, again, hit the most home runs in Mets history, it still feels like we were shortchanged, and he shortchanged himself, in effect. It's great to see that he's kind of found, whatever life he wants to live. It seems like he's found some peace, mm-hmm. and he's straightened his life out, and that's great. And it's really good to see, because we never thought that was going to happen. But yeah, his career still is just one that it's one of the greatest what if careers in baseball history, and specifically with the Mets, because we all thought that maybe he was going to be possibly a career-long Met and 500 home run hitter. But in terms of Mets history, and in terms of the greatest players in Mets history, he still stands among the best, maybe in the top 5.
And left field, Cleon Jones. Could you tell us about Cleon Jones for maybe the people who don't know Cleon Jones?
Yeah. Now, Cleon Jones is probably the most important hitter of the first 2 decades of Mets history. I think, as we were talking about with Jerry Grote, if you look at Jerry Grote's hitting stats, hey, maybe it doesn't compare with other catchers of other eras. If you look at Cleon Jones and you look at maybe like his power numbers, it doesn't line up, or it doesn't, compare favorably maybe with the Darryl Strawberry or Carlos Beltran. But back in the late 60s when pitching was so dominant, specifically 68, the year of the pitcher, but 69, there was still a lot of dominant pitching, and hitting was a little more at a premium. But he hit 340 that year, was third in the league in batting average, and for a team in which runs were at a premium, the Mets had fantastic pitching, but runs were often hard to come by. Cleon Jones was the guy that you could count on the most, and he was so important to the success of that team, that offense, in winning the World Series. So he had some down years, but 69 was so important. Had 1971 he hit over 300. 1973 was injury plagued, but he was so important and so clutch in September of that year, and that was the September in which the Mets went from last place to first place to win the National League East, and I believe he had 6 home runs in the final 10 games. So Cleon Jones, when he left the Mets, he retired shortly after he left the Mets. He went to the White Sox and pretty much was retired and really didn't have the legs to continue. Was very high up on a lot of hitting statistics in Mets history. So very, very vital to the success of the Mets, specifically in 69.
And right behind those three, you had some interesting choices. Could you talk about those?
Yeah, so left field, the backup in left field is where I got a little creative. I had debated internally between Kevin McReynolds and Michael Conforto. The reason I had Michael Conforto as a possible left fielder is because he's still to this day has played more games there. And even through this year, if you were to play 150 games in right field, he'd still have more games in left field. I believe so. I think it's something we're close to that. But I put him in left field, and I actually went with Conforto over McReynolds because the two are so evenly matched in terms of OPS plus. Actually, Conforto is a little bit higher. Home runs, McReynolds is a little higher, but Conforto is on the verge of passing him. And in fact, I believe he's the second fastest Met to reach 100 home runs. So say what you will about his inconsistency, and I will agree to that. I think he kind of be, great one day and terrible the next. But overall, if you look at his season-long stats, he's been pretty consistent. And last year, he produced his best year by far. I went with him a little bit forward thinking. Maybe it's dangerous to do that, but because they were so close, and because to be transparent, I kind of wanted this book to kind of be relevant in June or July when hopefully Conforto has had a successful first half of the 2020 season. I went with him there. As far as other outfield positions, right field had Rusty Staub. That was also for the reason why Conforto moved to left field, because I wanted to have as Rusty Staub. I figured was a pretty solid choice for what he did for the teams in 72, 73, 75 when he was traded, and then came back and was specifically a pinch hitter and a great pinch hitter. Led the league in pinch hits and pinch hit RBIs. So he was the backup in right field, and then center field I had 2 backups. I couldn't have a team without Mookie Wilson, who is one of many fans' favorite players and one of my favorite players, just in the great the attitude and spirit that he brought to the team. Not to mention the how quick he was and held all the stolen base and triples records before Jose Reyes. And then also in addition to Mookie, I had Tommy Agee. We talked about Cleon Jones, how important he was to the offense of 69. If Cleon Jones is the most important offensive player, Tommy Agee is the second most important probably. He had a great year with the bat, but also his fielding was sensational, and never more so than in Game 3 of the World Series with those 2 great catches. And everyone might forget, he hit the leadoff home run in the bottom of the first of that game. So he saved 5 runs. He produced 1 run, and the Mets won 5-0 in that game. So I made sure to include Tommy Agee because not only did he have a very good Mets career, but he had probably the greatest fielding performance by any player in World Series history.
And I was so psyched last night. I was reading the book. You mentioned my two of my favorite players, better favorite players who, you know, not a lot of people mention as far as the greatest outfielders is Kevin McReynolds and Lee Mazzilli for honorable mention.
Mhm.
Could you tell me about those two? You just mentioned Kevin McReynolds. He was a very good fielder in the
Yeah,
outfield, and we talked
yeah.
about him coming over in that trade that might have been the downfall of his perception from the fans.
Yeah, so a good thing that you pointed out his fielding because Kevin McReynolds was a very underrated fielder. I believe he might have led the league in assists. Was an underrated stolen, base stealer. I think he stole 21 bases without getting caught, or maybe he stole all the bases he stole in '88. He did not get caught, but was a very good player. Again, certainly worthy of being on the team, but with a 30-man roster, he just kind of just missed and was third in the MVP vote in '88. But the trade, he came over in a trade in 1987 or before the '87 season that sent Kevin Mitchell to San Diego. McReynolds had been with the Padres, but came over to the Mets. A lot of people perceive that, myself included, that chipped away at the attitude of the '62 Mets. 62, the '86 Mets, because the rest of the league was a little bit fearful or kind of disdained the Mets because they just had this this bravado that helped them win the World Championship, and a guy like Kevin Mitchell personified that bravado. Even though he wasn't a starter, he was just kind of that guy that brought a certain attitude, along with Ray Knight, who also they got rid of in the '86 offseason. So the moves to get rid of Ray Knight and to trade Kevin Mitchell, uh, you know, kind of, as I said, chipped away at that attitude. And unfortunately, Kevin McReynolds, because his attitude was just kind of a little more laissez-faire. Sometimes you didn't know if he really wanted to be at the stadium. He kind of was an easy target for fans, and I think that happened late in his career with the Mets. Is that kind of his the attitude that might be perceived as lackadaisical, kind of was to his detriment.